When a human being migrates, he takes with him his seeds and songs, to quote here Mark Twain. He takes also with him his suffering and joy. However, he cannot stop himself from being translated into yet another creative and created being. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you today about the situation of translating on the shifting ground of globalization, technology, and migration. The scale and rapidity of globalization processes today and the new human migration pattern, forced or voluntary, are providing an added layer of both opportunities and challenges for translation and interpreting practice. Therefore, we felt it is time to examine again the impacts of this new layer on the work of translators and interpreters. Globalization is increasingly omnipresent and is clearly an extremely significant and complex process of structural transformation. It can be even argued that it is the most considerable change in human history. This has been translated in so many areas, but particularly in social relationships and migration patterns. Prior to the current phase of globalization, it could be argued that one of the main traits depicting the character of people, things, information, places, and so on, was their great solidity. All of them tended to be solid and hard, metaphorically speaking, of course, and not literally speaking. And therefore, they are likely to keep the same shape and remain in place. People, for instance, tended to stay more where they were born and raised, and were less likely to endeavor to go outside of their native village, town, or country. Their networks and communication contacts were restricted solely to those who were nearby. This also applies to a large extent to most objects, tools, food, cuisine, and so on, which tended to be used where they were produced. Before the digital revolution, for example, newspapers were distributed only locally or nationally. However, now everything has changed. Everything has changed. We entered the phase of liquidity. Globalization is being approached here as a process of increasing liquidity, to quote Zygmunt Bauman here. It is the phase in which everything does not resist change and does not keep its shape and form for long. Constant and rapid change, motivated by digitalization, has become the norm rather than the exception. This can be seen in many areas, such as foreign trade and global financial transactions and interactions on the internet, such as on Facebook and Twitter. Similarly, stopping the flows of human trafficking, drugs, pornography, and illegal migration has become an extremely onerous burden, if not an impossible mission. Over the past couple of decades, the internet has become a worldwide public resource and integral part of daily life for people around the world. With the exploding number of smartphones and similar internet-enabled devices, the use of the internet will become even more embedded in the way our jobs are being performed and our minds are being used as we move forward in the way towards the 21st century. It is the era of the internet, the rise of digital media, and a globalized and information-based society, where the internet is impacting on all areas. The way we do shopping, the way we acquire knowledge, and the ways in which companies, governments, parliaments, organizations operate. But what perhaps makes the recent globalization phase so special is the full reliance on global interconnectedness, facilitated by greater access to international travel and more international commercial exchange, as well as military conflicts and wars, such as the war on terror, or the so-called war on terror, all of which are factors highly dependent on multilingual communication, both human and machine translators, here I mean. The role of translation has always been a key pillar for the infrastructure that makes globalization possible. This intensified relationship between globalization and translation arises also from cultures coming in contact because of voluntary or forced migration and legal or illegal migration. The migration phenomenon is fundamentally mediated by interpreters or cultural mediators, they are now called, or some of them at least. Migrants are powerful agents of change. They transform and at the same time are transformed by the communities in which they start to live. Translation is a crucial element in this process. My perspective on the issue of migration is influenced by the assignment I had in Greece, in which I served refugees and asylum seekers over there. The mission was performed for the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, and my work focused on the refugee camps and the asylum office in the north of the country, in Thessaloniki, basically, and in Idomeni refugee camp in particular. I thought it is such a relevant story to tell in this context. To tell my own story, to tell my own experience with refugees, aid providers, and other colleague interpreters in Greece. With the primary task of interpreting, I conducted a survey or a study on the refugee plight and the translation crisis. In addition to the notes that I took during this research and this assignment, I interviewed refugees, asylum seekers, aid providers, and more importantly, the interpreters and cultural mediators. Back to some facts and statistics. According to UNHCR statistics, by the start of 2016, 11.6 million Syrians had been displaced, nearly half of Syria's entire population. The exodus from Syria was the biggest refugee population from a single conflict. And more importantly, it was the first of its kind in a fully digital age where refugees rely on their smartphones and phone charging stations to be able to find safe, alternative safe routes at different border crossings. Despite the advantages offered by technology to refugees, their journeys often expose them to considerable risk and treacherous conditions, as many refugees reported. From the time of their arrival, Syrian refugees, who do not speak English, of course, were baffled by the Greek language they heard spoken by the Greek citizens. And English and other European languages spoken by the personnel of international organizations such as UNHCR, Médecins Sans Frontières, and EASO. It's true that there is less in the news now of the refugee crisis, but the suffering is still on. The suffering started from the decision they have taken to navigate treacherous waters and undertake long and tortuous journeys and cross borders. But this is a story of another type of border, a different kind of border obstacle. It is a barrier that people do not hear much about. It is the fence of language. The fence affects their entire life, their needs, healthcare, and communication as a whole. So many refugees told me that the biggest obstacle when getting relief and healthcare services was the language barrier. It is extremely frustrating for a refugee or an asylum seeker to have enormous needs, and at the same time, they lack the ability to communicate them to other people for help, of course. Integration is hampered and isolation becomes overwhelming, unfortunately. However, after taking all the way from Syria to Greece, and suddenly you hear someone speaking in Arabic, you will feel relieved. The interpreter becomes a source of relief, aid, security, and hope, in the sense. So many refugees who speak English volunteered, and they have seen this in so many instances. They have volunteered to act as interpreters or cultural mediators. But they have the experience that words and people fall through the cracks of the informal scheme of interpreting. Interpreters can be presented as agents who are bearing witness to the suffering of refugees, and presented also as messengers of peace and compassion or empathy. One interpreter said once, "The wounds and misery are enormous. Words have failed me, but at least I have found my way on how to calm people and refugees down." Another interpreter reported that when he started the job, he found problems sleeping at night due to the terrible stories he has heard, as well as the scale and severity of the humanitarian plight in the camps, especially the Idomeni camp. There are stories of families who had to leave their destroyed homes in Aleppo, Idlib, Damascus, and the story of a lady who had to give birth to her 4-month child when looking for a safe escape route in the middle of nowhere. And this is a quote from another female refugee. She said, "It was like a nightmare. I was alone with my 3 kids on a small old motorboat fighting an extremely rough sea when the boat suddenly ran short of gasoline." So many interpreters said they saw how stories ended and how people fell to their death. The presence of interpreters both as human beings and as linguists, is reassuring by all means. Greeting refugees and newly arrived migrants in their own language can only have a great emotional impact and can deflate anxiety. After all, the job of the interpreter is to come to the rescue of people when they are down. So, translation, in this sense, attempts to bring back a sense of normality and a feeling or a taste of home. The interpreter needs to have a very loud and sharp voice, needs to be a good public speaker to be able to translate instructions and relief information to a huge gathering of refugees. And most of the gatherings are huge. Why? Because as soon as refugees, they see an interpreter, they rush out of their tents to ask loads of difficult and different questions and to see whether or not there is an update on the immigration policy of the EU governments, which have become much more restrictive. Another interpreter reported that he pays more attention to children. He gently taps them on the shoulder, asks them about their needs, and plays with them if need be. In camps, interpreting becomes more demanding. Translating between refugees and doctors, and here I quote another interpreter, she said, "This is extremely challenging." Quote, "Medical terms are hard. I'm just pointing to body parts to sort things out for them." So, and interpreters are also very sensitive to what they hear. Sometimes refugees tell certain things to the interpreters that they do not dare spell out to other refugees or even to their own family members. They trust the interpreters. They trust the interpreters. However, bad or false interpreting means the wrong diagnosis, means even the wrong treatment. One interpreter noted, "If I get something wrong, I might hurt someone." She added, "One day you will be translating and explaining how to register in the relocation system, and another day you will be translating a story of how a refugee had survived a fatal explosion in Aleppo, and a third day you will be translating how a woman had been subjected to rape." End quote. So if there is a place in which the interpreters are most visible, it is the refugee camp. If you need a doctor, a psychologist, and a social worker, a lawyer, or anyone else, any other help, unless you speak English, you are almost certainly going to need an interpreter. Interpreting, therefore, is really a fine-tuned skill. And the stakes are high when it goes wrong. So in the refugee camps, the demand for interpreters is extremely high. And there is not enough trained interpreters to meet the demand. So often informal interpreters will step in to patch the gaps. You will find young people translating for their parents or refugees, and some other refugees that are translating for people living in their own camps, which makes confidentiality extremely tricky. The settlement in the camp is just a transit before refugees start another treacherous journey. In the camps, refugees gather around interpreters and relief agencies to complain about noise, not being able to sleep, lack of privacy, and so on. But what makes their experience even harder is their inability to speak the language. If I wish to go out of the camp, one refugee spelled this out, another adventure begins for me. So if they would like to take public transport, go shopping, or even start a new emotional life, finding friends, and so on, they need to speak the language. You are nothing. You are a dead person. That's why the presence of the interpreter is equated with a new life granted to them. Most of them cannot read and write in their mother tongue, let alone in a foreign language. So those refugees feel like they are in a limbo. Little by little they become isolated, and little by little the camp becomes like a wider prison. One interpreter reported that he is critical. He's critical of the asylum system for not doing much about the refugee crisis, but also he is equally critical of refugees themselves for not doing much to break their isolation. Try to approach this from another perspective, the interpreting crisis, the refugee crisis, and try to link it with the migration studies. Migration studies have drawn ideas from the theory and practice of translation as a means for considering the wider effects of the ways in which cultures are transmitted and developed and in context, either historically through the operation of colonial expansion, slavery, migration, and the consequent global diaspora of millions of people, or more recently through the processes of globalization, immigration, and the movement of refugee that characterizes our own era. So the concept of cultural translation or cultural mediation, which we will be addressing, cultural translation, will be addressing in a separate episode. Cultural translation seems to offer a means of thinking about these processes and thinking about the ways that cultures are transported, transmitted, reinterpreted, and realigned through local places, local contacts, local cultures, and of course, local languages. It also helps articulating the realities of how individuals on both sides experience and interpret such encounters in the contact zone between different cultures. And I think the first contact zone is the refugee camp. This needs to become the focus of more recent studies about translation. These ideas have already given particular attention to the question of power, resistance, and domination in those kinds of interactions, and foregrounded the possibility of translation as a means of cultural and political intervention. To conclude, I would like to say that in emergency situations, like in the refugee camps, choosing one's own words carefully is not only important, but also decisive. Words might affect the lives of other people. This talk suggests also that the traditional view of interpreters as neutral and callous agents, as well as passive carriers of meaning, which is still the dominant view in most professional codes of conduct or codes of ethics. So this view does not fit reality anymore. And the question about the role of interpreters is closely related to the question of how interpreting is being carried out or practiced on the ground. And here I would like to end with a quote from a refugee who was a professor of philosophy in Idlib. When asked about his life as a refugee, he answered with the following statement, which I think applies to both refugees and interpreters. Interpreters are also refugees, and refugees, as we have seen, are also interpreters. He said, quote, in Arabic, وَتَحْسَبُ أَنَّكَ لَاجِئٌ فَقِيرٌ وَإِلَيْكَ لَجَأَ الْعَالَمُ الْأَكْبَرُ وَتَحْسَبُ أَنَّكَ لَاجِئٌ فَقِيرٌ وَإِلَيْكَ لَجَأَ الْعَالَمُ الْأَكْبَرُ. Means, you think that you are an insignificant poor refugee, and yet in you all of the cosmos sought refuge. You think that you are an insignificant poor refugee, and yet in you all of the cosmos sought refuge. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.